Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our reading of Pride and Prejudice. We are going through this book chapter by chapter. I am reading you the chapter with frequent interpositions of my own opinions, exclamations, and boy, oh boy, have we hit a fascinating part. Mr. Darcy proposed to Elizabeth Bennet. Out of the blue, for her, maybe not for you as a reader, but for her, totally out of the blue. The last thing in the world she expected. And he did it in a horrible way of enumerating all the reasons why he shouldn't do it. How it's bad for me, your connections are inferior, your people are embarrassing, you yourself are an inferior social level. All these things are against it, and yet I can't help myself. The heart wants what the heart wants. Naturally, she took it poorly and refused him in, as we heard yesterday, no uncertain terms. You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. She throws everything at him. All the accusations, all the bile that she's stored up for weeks now, months now. That you pried Mr. Bingley away from my sister and kept him away from her. Much to her hurt, much to her heartbreak. She is sad every day because of what you did. And you deprived Mr. Wickham of his living. He was all but promised a living on your father's estates by your father, who thought of him as a great favorite. And then when your father died, you denied it to him, forcing him to take his chances buying a commission at the local militia. She throws all of that in his face, plus the fact that he is arrogant and overweening, and also the main damning aspect of his proposition of marriage, which is how it's done. And it infuriates him. He becomes ice cold and pale with rage, because no one has ever talked to him that way. Certainly no woman ever has. And now we are at chapter 35. Elizabeth woke the next morning to the same thoughts and meditations which had at length closed her eyes. She could not yet recover from the surprise of what had happened. It was impossible to think of anything else, and totally indisposed for employment, she resolved soon after breakfast to indulge herself in air and exercise. Walk it off. She was proceeding directly to her favorite walk when the recollection of Mr. Darcy's sometimes coming there stopped her, and instead of entering the park, she turned up the lane, which led her farther from the turnpike road. The park paling was still the boundary on one side, and she soon passed one of the gates into the ground. She doesn't want to meet Darcy, the last person on earth she wants to meet. After walking 2 or 3 times along that part of the lane, she was tempted by the pleasantness of the morning to stop at the gates and look into the park. The 5 weeks which she had now passed in Kent had made a great difference in the country, and every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. She was on the point of continuing her walk when she caught sight of the glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park. He was moving that way, and fearful of it being Mr. Darcy, she was directly retreating. But the person who advanced was now near enough to see her, and stepping forward with earnestness, pronounced her name. She had turned away, but on hearing herself called, though in a voice which proved it to be Mr. Darcy, she moved again towards the gate. So she did indeed meet him. He had by that time reached it also, and holding out a letter, which she instinctively took, said with a look of haughty composure, "I have been walking in the grove some time in the hope of meeting you. Will you do me the honor of reading that letter?" And then, with a slight bow, turned again into the plantation and was soon out of sight. That's it. Don't read it while I'm standing here. Nothing like that. Just please read this. With no expectation of pleasure, but with the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter, and to her still increasing wonder, perceived an envelope containing 2 sheets of letter paper written quite through, in a very close hand. The envelope itself was likewise full. Pursuing her way along the lane, she then began it. It was dated from Rosings at 8 o'clock in the morning, and was as follows. So Mr. Darcy wrote this thing just this morning. This is the letter. This is the entire rest of the chapter, is Darcy's letter. "Be not alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter, by the apprehension of it containing any repetition of those sentiments, or renewal of those offers, which were last night so disgusting to you. I write without any intention of paining you, or humbling myself, by dwelling on wishes which, for the happiness of both, cannot too soon be forgotten. And the effort which the formation and the perusal of this letter must occasion, should have been spared had not my character required it to be written and read. You must therefore pardon the freedom with which I demand your attention. Your feelings, I know, will bestow it unwillingly, but I demand it of your justice. He is a wronged person, he's saying. Two offenses of a very different nature and by no means equal magnitude you last night laid to my charge. The first mentioned was that, regardless of the sentiments of either, I had detached Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other that I had, in defiance of various claims, in defiance of honor and humanity, ruined the immediate prosperity and blasted the prospects of Mr. Wickham. Willfully and wantonly to have thrown off the companion of my youth and the acknowledged favourite of my father, a young man who had scarcely any other dependence than that of our patronage, and who had been brought up to expect its exertion, would be a depravity to which the separation of two young persons whose affections could be the growth of only a few weeks could bear no comparison. In other words, he's saying Jane and Bingley only knew each other for a couple of weeks. As bad as that might have been, it's nowhere near as bad as you accusing me of betraying a childhood friend of mine. But from the severity of that blame which was last night so liberally bestowed, respecting each circumstance, I shall hope to be in the future secured, when the following account of my actions and their motives has been read. If, in the explanation of them which is due to myself, I am under the necessity of relating feelings which may be offensive to yours, I can only say that I am sorry. The necessity must be obeyed, and farther apology would be absurd. I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I saw, in common with others, that Bingley preferred your eldest sister to any other young woman in the country. But it was not till the evening of the dance at Netherfield that I had any apprehension of his feeling a serious attachment. I had often seen him in love before. At that ball, while I had the honour of dancing with you, I was first made acquainted by Sir William Lucas's accidental information that Bingley's attentions to your sister had given rise to the general expectation of their marriage. He spoke of it as a certain event, of which the time alone could be undecided. From that moment I observed my friend's behaviour attentively, and I could perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I had ever witnessed in him. Your sister also I watched. Her look and manners were open, cheerful, engaging as ever, but without any symptom of peculiar regard, and I remained convinced from the evening's scrutiny that though she received his attention with pleasure, she did not invite them by any participation of sentiment. In other words, he thinks it's all one way. That Jane is just being pleasant, but is not moonstruck by him at all. If you have not been mistaken here, I must have been in error. Your superior knowledge of your sister must make the latter probable. If it be so, if I have been misled by such an error to inflict pain on her, your resentment has not been unreasonable. But I shall not scruple to assert that by the serenity of your sister's countenance, and the air was such as might have been given the most acute observer a conviction that however amiable her temper, her heart was not likely easily to be touched. That I was desirous of believing her indifferent is certain, but I will venture to say that my investigations and decisions are not usually influenced by my hopes and fears. I did not believe her to be indifferent because I wished it. I believed it on impartial conviction, as truly as I wished it in reason. My objections to the marriage were not merely those which last night I acknowledged to have required the utmost force of passion to put aside in my own case. The want of connection could not be so great an evil to my friend as to me. He just can't help being a jerk, even when he's trying not to be. He's saying, well, it wouldn't matter as much to Bingley if his wife had no connections as it would to me, considering I'm so much more important than he is. But there were also causes of repugnance, causes which, though still existing to an equal degree in both instances, I had myself endeavored to forget, because they were not immediately before me. These causes must be stated briefly, though briefly. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly, betrayed by herself, her 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me, it pains me to offend you, but amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you some consolation to consider that to have conducted yourself so as to avoid any share of like censure is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your eldest sister than it is honorable to the sense and disposition of both. In other words, he's saying, yes, not just he's implying that not just he, but everyone thinks this about her family, except for her and Jane. No one thinks they're the same as the rest of their family. It's pretty bad. That's cause for enragement. Uh, I will only say farther that from what passed that evening, my opinion of all parties was confirmed, and every inducement heightened which could have led me before to preserve my friend from what I esteemed a most unhappy connection. He left Netherfield for London on the day following, as you, I am certain, remember, with the design of soon returning. The part which I acted is now to be explained. His sister's uneasiness had been equally excited with my own. Our coincidence of feeling was soon discovered, and, alike sensible that no time was to be lost in detaching their brother, we shortly resolved on joining him directly in London. We accordingly went, and there I readily engaged in the office of pointing out to my friend the certain evils of such a choice. I described and enforced them earnestly. But however this remonstrance might have staggered or delayed his determination, I do not suppose that it would ultimately have prevented the marriage, had it not been seconded by the assurance which I hesitated not in giving of your sister's indifference. I know that Darcy's putting this really well, but he is such a crap heel. Elizabeth was right when she heard this from Colonel Fitzwilliam. What right is he to judge? What right is he to interfere? None. He had not before believed her to return his affection with sincere, if not equal, regard. Or he had before believed that. But Bingley has great natural modesty, with a stronger dependence on my judgment than on his own. To convince him, therefore, that he had deceived himself was not a very difficult point. To persuade him against returning into Hertfordshire when that conviction had been given was scarcely the work of a moment. I cannot blame myself for having done thus much. You should, you ass. There is but one part in my conduct in the whole affair on which I do not reflect with satisfaction. It is that I condescended to adopt the measures of art so far as to conceal from him your sister's being in town. So not just lying to him. Art, meaning I know she's going to be at X location, so I'll make sure we don't go there. I knew it myself, as it was known to Miss Bingley, but her brother is even yet ignorant of it. Bingley still doesn't know that Jane is in town. 10 minutes from him. That they might have met without ill consequence is perhaps probable, but his regard did not appear to me to be enough extinguished for him to see her without some danger. Perhaps this concealment, this disguise, was beneath me. You think? It is done, however, and it was done for the best. On this subject I have nothing more to say, no other apology to offer. If I have wounded your sister's feelings, it was unknowingly done, and though the motives which govern me may to you very naturally appear insufficient, I have not yet learnt to condemn them. Then we move on to the other subject. That's the most that he's going to say about blighting Jane's happiness, is that he didn't think she was all that into Mr. Bingley. Now we move on to the real subject, Mr. Wickham. With respect to that other, more weighty accusation of having injured Mr. Wickham, I can only refute it by laying before you the whole of his connection with my family. Of what he has particularly accused me of, I am ignorant, but the truth of what I shall relate, I can summon more than one witness of undoubted veracity. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man who had for many years the management of all the Pemberley estates, and whose good conduct in the discharge of his trust naturally inclined my father to be of service to him. And on George Wickham, who was his godson, his kindness was therefore liberally bestowed. My father supported him at school and afterwards at Cambridge. Most important assistance, as his own father, always poor from extravagance of his wife, would have been unable to give him a gentleman's education. Meaning, his father was the proctor of all of the Pemberley estates, but his wife was extravagant, so he didn't have the money to send young Wickham to school or to university. My father was not only fond of this young man's society, whose manners were always engaging, he also had the highest opinion of him, and hoping the church would be his profession, intended to provide for him in it. As for myself, it is many, many years since I first began to think of him in a very different manner. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, which he was careful to guard from the knowledge of his best friend, could not escape the observation of a young man of nearly the same age with himself, and who had opportunities of seeing him in unguarded moments, which Mr. Darcy could not have. I wonder what young Wickham and young Darcy did together. I wonder what sorts of things Darcy's talking about here. The mind wanders as to what sorts of offenses, what sorts of vicious appetites Darcy might be talking about here. Here again I shall give you pain. To what degree only you can tell. But whatever may be sentiments which Mr. Wickham has created, a suspicion of their nature shall not prevent me from unfolding his real character. It adds even another motive. My excellent father died about 5 years ago, and his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended it to me, to promote his advancement in the best manner that his profession might allow, and if he took orders, desired that a valuable family living might be his as soon as it became vacant. Those of you who are coming to this book brand new, the local grandee, got to dispose of church livings. So if a big vicarage, acres, maybe an orchard or two, maybe dependent fields of farmers, lots and lots of income, a big house that's just a hair shy of a palace. If a living like that came open, meaning if its occupant died, the old Mr. Darcy would be able to just say who gets that job, and it would be Wickham. Let's see here. There was also a legacy of £1,000. His own father did not long survive mine, and within half a year from these events, Mr. Wickham wrote to inform me that, having finally resolved against taking orders, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage. In other words, if I'm not going into holy orders, then maybe more than £1,000. What do you think, pal? Sport. In lieu of preferment, by which he could not be benefited. He's not planning on being preferred into the clergy. He had some intention, he added, of studying the law, and I must be aware that the interest of £1,000 would be very insufficient support therein. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not to be a clergyman. What a line, just tossed in there. Just the same as with Bingley. An amazingly insightful line just tossed in there. I've seen Bingley in Love before. And here another one. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not to be a clergyman. Devastating, like a bomb going off, especially since it's not elaborated on. The business was therefore soon settled. He resigned all claim to assistance in the church, were it possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted in return £3,000. All connection between us seemed now dissolved. I thought too ill of him to invite him to Pemberley or admit his society in town. In town I believe he chiefly lived, but his studying of law was a mere pretense, and being now free from all restraint, his life was a life of idleness and dissipation. For about 3 years I heard little of him, but on the decease of the incumbent of the living which had been designed for him, he applied to me again by letter for the presentation. He's already said he isn't interested. Signed a letter to that effect. But now he knows, he's out of money, and now he knows that living is now free. That's many, many £1,000 a year, not just one gift. His circumstances, he assured me, and I found no difficulty in believing it, were exceedingly bad. He had found the law a most unprofitable study, and was now absolutely resolved on being ordained, if I would present him to the living in question, of which he trusted there could be little doubt, as he was well assured that I had no other person provided for, and I could not have forgotten that my revered father's intentions. You will hardly blame me for refusing to comply with this entreaty, or for resisting every repetition of it. His resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse of me to others as in his reproaches to myself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived I know not, but last summer he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. I must now mention a circumstance which I wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than the present would induce me to unfold to any human being. Having said thus much, I feel no doubt of your secrecy. This is a huge confidence that he's giving to Elizabeth, the story that he's about to tell. It touches on him more nearly than anything that would touch on himself. There is one person in the world that this present prickish Darcy cares about more than he cares about himself. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago, she was taken from school and an establishment formed for her in London, and last summer she went with the lady who presided over it to Ramsgate, and thither also went Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly by design, for there proved to have been a prior acquaintance between him and Mrs. Young, in whose character we were most unhappily deceived. That's That's her young Miss Darcy's attendant, is Mrs. Young. And by her connivance and aid, he so far recommended himself to Georgiana, that's Darcy's sister, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love, and to consent to an elopement. She was then but 15, which must be her excuse, and after stating her imprudence, I am happy to add that I owed the knowledge of it to herself. In other words, Georgiana came forward to Darcy and said, "What's happening?" She wasn't trying to deceive him. I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended elopement, and then Georgiana, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. I'd like you to tell me. I'd certainly like you to tell me. Did you use foul language on Wickham? Did you strike him? Regard for my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure, but I wrote to Mr. Wickham, who left the place immediately, and Mrs. Young was, of course, removed from her charge. Mr. Wickham's chief object was unquestionably my sister's fortune, which is £30,000. £30,000. But I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was also a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. This, madam, is a faithful narrative of every event in which we have been concerned together, and if you do not absolutely reject it as false, you will, I hope, acquit me henceforth of cruelty towards Mr. Wickham. I know not in what manner, under what form of falsehood he has imposed on you, but his success is not perhaps to be wondered at, ignorant as you are previously of everything concerning either. Detection could not be in your power, and suspicion certainly not in your inclination. You may possibly wonder why all this was not told to you last night, but I was not then master enough of myself to know what could or ought to be revealed. For the truth of everything here related, I can appeal more directly to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam, who from our near relationship and constant intimacy was still more as one of the executors of my father's will, has been unavoidably acquainted with every particular of these transactions. Notice earlier Darcy said that he has multiple witnesses to the truth of what he's saying. Here he mentions Colonel Fitzwilliam, but I can think of at least one other that we're going to meet. If your abhorrence of me should make my assertions valueless, you cannot be prevented by the same cause from confiding in my cousin. And that there may be possibility of consulting him, I shall endeavor to find some opportunity of putting this letter in your hands in the course of the morning. I will only add, God bless you. Signed, Fitzwilliam Darcy. A bombshell. That is Darcy explaining himself to Elizabeth. He did not trust himself to do it verbally. He knows she doesn't want to see him. But he couldn't stand the accusations that she made, either one of them. I think we can agree he made a better job refuting the one than the other. He acted like an officious busybody with Jane. What difference does it make if he doesn't think her heart is in the matter? Bingley's heart was in the matter. He knows that for sure. What does he think? What does he think a country girl who's about to be dispossessed and lose her home is going to do, even if she doesn't return all the extent of Bingley's affection? When she gets 10,000 a year, she's going to say no? She's going to suddenly say, "I'm sorry, I'm jilting you"? No. He does not acquit himself of the first one, and he rubs salt in the wound by referring to the deficiencies of Elizabeth's family, even her father. But on the second point, not only does he lay out everything, but he, at this point in the book, before you've read the incredible next chapter, you notice at least one thing, which is that he's not asking Elizabeth to believe him. He has an impartial witness, someone Elizabeth likes and trusts, and who has no romantic relationship with her, and is not completely under Darcy's thumb like she suspects Bingley would be. Mr. Darcy's saying, I know you don't like me and you don't trust me, but no matter what you think about me, Colonel Fitzwilliam was involved in all of this and can corroborate what I'm saying. All of which are factual. Darcy's not talking about anything opinion-based. He's saying that Wickham turned down the preferment that he was going to get and wanted money instead so that he could study the law. Then he disappeared. Then he came back asking for the preferment because the money was gone. All of that is factual. There will be other people that know those things. That's the letter. And the chapter just ends flat right there. So you have a choice now. You can either read the next chapter or not. This is what kills me. When snobs and reverse snobs, either snobs or that Jane Austen had no interest in the popular literature of his day, that she was on Mount Helicon creating these gorgeous novels. And the anti-snobs will say, well, sure, she had an interest in Sir Walter Scott-style potboilers, she just wasn't any good at it. Show me a cliffhanger anywhere in Western literature that's better than this one. It's not a pointed gun, but show me a cliffhanger. Show me anybody who could not read the next chapter when this chapter ends with Fitzwilliam Darcy. So we will move on to the next chapter next time. We'll see how this letter sits with Elizabeth. One of the most astonishing moments in all of Western literature. So, I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.